This conference will now be recorded.
So every airport is an aerodrome, but not every aerodrome is an airport, right? Like I could go out and buy a farmer's field and build a grass strip to fly my plane in and out of, and that would be an aerodrome, but it would not be an airport unless I actually went to Transport Canada and said, hey, I want to get this certified as an airport. Okay. So aerodromes can be certified for public use, so a public aerodrome that anyone can fly their plane into. You can have an aerodrome certified for private use, so again, like the grass strip in my backyard. You can have a registered aerodrome, so that would be an airport, right? So like London International, or a military aerodrome, like Trenton, which some of you guys might have been to. Aerodromes in Canada are listed in what's called, in this book called the Canada Flight Supplement. And basically every single aerodrome in Canada that wants to be, right, so even if it's private, I can still have the government publish this in the Canada Flight Supplement. And so the CFS, as it's called, has a little, it's like an index for every aerodrome. It has a little diagram of it. It tells you the runway length, if there's any lights, if there's a restaurant, the radio frequencies, if there are any, things like that. It tells you everything you need to know about every certified aerodrome in the country. And so even if I build a grass strip in my backyard, I can actually get that published in the CFS. And so the CFS is also updated. There's a new one released every 56 days with any updates that have occurred at any of these, right? Because there's so many of them that could change constantly in terms of any important information. It's always important to have the most current CFS when you're flying. Okay, so the parts of the aerodrome used for surface movement of aircraft is called the movement area, which includes the aprons and maneuvering areas. And then within that, maneuvering areas include parts of the aerodrome intended for the taking off and landing of aircraft, so runways and taxiways. So the movement area, you can think of that as, the tarmac, so where the airplanes actually are. So they move around on those parts, right? The terminal, for example, would not be a movement area because that's where humans go. The movement area refers to the parts where the planes can move around. Okay, so now let's talk about runway numbering, which you might have wondered about before in the past. So airport runways are numbered by their magnetic bearing rounded to the nearest 10 degrees. So what that means is they're numbered by the direction that they're pointing into. So if I take off on runway 28, I'm taking off into a compass heading of 280 degrees on my compass, rounded to the nearest 10 degrees, right? So if I'm building a runway that's pointing at 282 degrees, then I would just round it to nearest 10, so 280, and then chop off the last 0. So that would be runway 28. And there you go, the example on the slide there. A runway with a magnetic bearing of 18 would be numbered 02, right? Because you would round that 18 to 20, or 020, then you would chop off the last 0. So it would just be runway 02, or runway 2. So the number for the runway is painted on the approach side, right? So where you land or where you start taking off. And therefore every runway, right, like one physical runway has 2 numbers, right? So you can land in either direction depending on what the wind is doing, right? And so obviously each runway side is reciprocal to the other, so 180 degrees in the other direction. So the example here is if I have runway 02, right, on one side, if I'm coming in the other direction on that runway, it would now be runway 20, right, because you just added 180 degrees. Cool. So a couple of other nuances to runway numbering. So in northern domestic airspace, which is basically like far north Canada, runways are numbered by their true bearing instead of their compass bearing. And the reason for that is, remember last week we talked about compasses and how when you get really far north, where you're close to both the magnetic North Pole and the true North Pole, compasses become very, very unreliable. And so because they're so unreliable and the reading they give in a given location might change every single year, it doesn't really make sense to number your runways by the compass reading, since that might change next year and suddenly your runway technically has a different number. So in that case, you're going to number it by its true bearing. But when you get as far south as we are, and compass readings generally don't change that much because the movement of the magnetic North Pole doesn't impact us as much, we can do it by magnetic bearing. Cool. Another nuance, so at really big airports where you might have parallel runways, right? So in the picture there, that's Toronto Pearson. If you have two separate runways that are pointing in the same direction, right? So they would have the same number. So for example, one of them at Pearson is they have two runways that are numbered 2406, right? So 240 degrees in one direction, 06 or 60 degrees in the other direction. You would add L, C, or R to the end of their name. So just L or R if there's two of them. But if you have three parallel runways, which is pretty rare, but I think they have that in Detroit actually, you would have center as well, right? So if a certain runway is 24L, right, because it's the left of the two runways that are 24, the other side of that runway would be 06R, because flipped around, it's the right side of the two runways called 06. Okay, and then the last thing, so sometimes on a runway you have what's called a displaced threshold, which it basically means, so on this little picture of a runway, you can see how they have these two arrows at the bottom there pointing up towards, you have then that solid white line and then the kind of like barcode looking white line. So those barcode looking white lines there, that's where you're actually allowed to land. The arrows indicate a displaced threshold where there isn't enough clearance room on the approach side of the runway to land. So there might be two tall trees or something like that. So, yeah. Sorry, one sec. Okay. Sorry, let me just read some of your guys' questions.
Yeah, just hang on there a second. Hersey, what he means by the runway numbers is that in the southern domestic airspace, and I forget the latitude at which that takes place, the numbers are set up as magnetic compass headings. So like London 2709, 27 is one side of the runway. The 180 degree reciprocal of that is 09. So instead of writing on there 270 or 090, they eliminate the last 0. So you only have two numbers per runway. Okay? Do you understand that? Yes or no, please?
Yeah, let me know if that's all clear.
In the north domestic airspace, and again, I'm not sure what the latitude is for that, because remember we discussed last week how the magnetic headings can get a little wonky because the magnetic North Pole moves, and up there it's exaggerated as to how fast it moves. Then it'll go to the true north heading on the runway. So you get up into places like Iqaluit, Yellowknife, Alert, those types of places, then it'll be a true north heading. All right? We all good with that? Yes, Mohammed. Basically around to the nearest 10th. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Any further questions on that point?
So yeah, again.
Going twice? Perfect. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Foreman.
Cool. So yeah, if you like, let's say you want to build a runway that's pointing to 247 degrees. right? You would round it to the nearest tenth, which would be 250 degrees. Then you just take the last zero off. So that would be runway 25. Cool. Okay, so let's talk about aerodrome markings and lights. So first, a large cross, either white or yellow, displayed at each end of a runway or taxi indicates that it's unserviceable. So if an airport closes, for example, and the runway isn't being maintained, and there might be, rocks or trees or something growing on it, but you might not be able to see that from the sky, but the operator of the airport, before they closed it, wanted to let any future pilot know that that runway is now unserviceable, you just paint a giant white or yellow X at each end to indicate that it's no longer being used. And sometimes that's even the case at active airports where they've only closed one runway for whatever reason. Okay. Windsock.
A closed runway with an X on it. It's here in St. Thomas. One of the runways heading in the northeast southwest direction is closed because they don't have the money to rebuild it. So you'll see a big X on it. There's also a big lighted X on it for nighttime. So if you drive by on the north or on the south side of the airport, you'll see that big X there on the end of the runway.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing that actually. So yeah. Okay, so windsocks. So you might have seen.
Surprised too.
Yeah. So you might have seen a windsock before at an airport, right? Which is just that piece of like orange fabric that tells you how fast the wind is going. So something important to know is that for a standard windsock, if the wind is blowing and the windsock it becomes perfectly horizontal, there's roughly 15 knots of wind. An airport beacon is also something that every airport has to have, and that is a white light that's visible 10 nautical miles from the airport that rotates every 2 to 3 seconds. So you see a white light flashing every 2 to 3 seconds within 10 nautical miles of being at that airport. Some important lights that you'll find at night at an aerodrome. So runway lights are white, as you can see in the picture there. Runway threshold, so the approach side of a runway, the start of the runway, you can say, is marked with green. And then the other end would be red, right? So you know which side you're supposed to land into. And then taxiway lights are marked with blue. So once you've landed and you want to get to the terminal, just direct the plane in between the blue lights. Okay, so let's talk about approach lights. So approach lights, if you look in the picture in the bottom right, would be those 4 lights, 2 of which are red, 2 of which are white. And so approach lights can either be what's called the Visual Approach Slope Indicator System, VASIS, or PAPI, as it's called, which stands for Precision Approach Path Indicator System. And the purpose of both is the purpose of both is to tell you whether you're too high or too low when you're coming into land. And so the VASIS system is the top picture there, where you have 4 bars of lights, 2 on top of 2, right? So you look in the little diagram on the top there. So when you're coming into land and you see this system, if all of the lights are white, that means you're too high. If 2 of them are red and then 2 of them are white, that means you're coming in at the correct glide path, the correct height. And if all of them are red, that means you're too low coming into land. And so the PAPI system is the one in the actual photograph in this slide where you have just 1, 2, 3, 4 all side by side. And it's the same kind of system, right? Just a little more precise. So if it's too red, too white, that means you're coming in perfectly on the glide path. If all 4 are white, you're too high. If all 4 are red, you're too low. But it's a little more accurate because you can have 3 white and 1 red, for example, which means you're only a little too high, or 3 red and 1 white, so you're a little bit too low. But the purpose of both...
The little rhyme you need to remember for that is white on white, you're having a nice flight. Red on red, you're dead.
Yes.
Red on white, you're all right.
Indeed. So yeah. But something you have to be careful of is so in London, on the really big runways that I learned to fly on, for example, they have the PAPI system, but the thing is, they're made for the bigger planes that come into land more often in London, right? Like the Dash 8s and the 737s, which obviously come in on a different glide path than, you know, the tiny little plane that I fly would come in on. So it's a good guide, but you have to be aware of what it's built for and what kind of plane would use it more often, depending on what airport you're at. Cool. So let's talk about the aerodrome circuit. So what kind of path you're supposed to fly into an airport when you're coming into land. So this diagram shows the important kind of terms for what we fly. So you can see we have the downwind leg, for example, when you're coming in opposite to the direction that you're going to land in, but parallel to the runway. You have your base leg when you're perpendicular to the runway. You have your final approach when you're coming into land. You have your departure, and then your crosswind when you're perpendicular again, going to downwind leg. And then you have what's called the upwind leg, or the upwind side of the runway. So opposite to the circuit pattern that's being flown when you're just coming in. Okay, so let's talk about controlled and uncontrolled airports. So a controlled airport is one where you have a control tower who is directing traffic in the circuit and around the airport. So there's actually someone in a control tower who's able to issue instructions and clearances as to what all the planes around the airport are able to do, right? And so obviously that would be at busier airports where you have a lot of traffic. An uncontrolled airport is one where there isn't a control tower, and that means it's the responsibility of the pilots to maintain separation, i.e. to not hit each other, and to make sure they know what everyone else is doing. And the way they do that is you broadcast your intention, so you tell people what you're doing on what's either called a mandatory frequency or an aerodrome traffic frequency. So it's not a control tower saying, okay, you do this, you do that, you come into land now, you go here, you go there. It's you're telling everyone else what you want to be doing and when you're going to be doing it and how you're going to be doing it. And you're listening to other people telling you their intentions as well. And you make sure, it's up to you to make sure you don't conflict with each other. Cool. So let's talk about light signals, which, I mean, I've never had to encounter personally, but they're important to know, and they usually, a couple questions about them come up on tests. So light signals are for aircraft flying without a radio, are also called NORDO. And when they're doing so at a busy airport, sometimes the control tower will use light signals to tell them what to do. So on the ground, when you have flashing green, that means you're cleared to taxi. When you have steady green, so just a constantly on green light, that means you're cleared for takeoff. If you have a flashing red light, that's telling you to taxi clear of the runway in use. If you see a steady red light, that tells you to stop. Flashing white, go back to your starting point, so back to the apron. And if there are blinking runway lights, that's telling everyone to get off the runway. Because there might be like a plane coming into land suddenly in an emergency or something like that. If you're flying without a radio in the sky and you see a steady green light, that means you're cleared to land. If you see a steady red light or a red flare, that means do not land, continue in the circuit. If you see a flashing green light, that means it's a recall signal. So if you're just flying near the airport, like practicing or something like that, and you see a flashing green light, that's telling you, okay, time to come, we want you to come back. And then that's usually followed by a steady green, which tells you you're cleared to come land now. If you see a flashing red light, that means the airport's not safe and don't land. And if you see a red pyrotechnical, which means like a firework or something, that means do not land for the time being. So if you're in the sky and you see this, the way you acknowledge, the way you tell the control tower that you've received the light message is if you're on the ground, if you're on the ground, you move your rudder and ailerons around, which obviously doesn't do anything if you're just on the ground. And then if you're in the sky, and you want to acknowledge it, you rock your wings back and forth, or you flash your landing light at night. Okay. Okay, so here's what we were talking about earlier, the airspace classifications. So you can see in the map there where southern domestic airspace and northern domestic airspace are, right? So you can see NDA is super, super far north, right? Like, and notice how it even curves around certain decently sized cities, right? So it goes around Yellowknife, it goes around Churchill, Manitoba, it goes around Iqaluit. So it's really, really rural, or like, yeah, and super far north. So the only major technical differences is that when you're in the northern domestic airspace, you always use true headings and true bearings in terms of everything, right? So how you're flying. And obviously that includes runways, as we talked about. And then when you're in the southern domestic airspace, you use magnetic. So that's the major difference. So these airspaces are also, so they're called northern domestic airspace, southern domestic airspace, but they're also called altimeter setting region and standard pressure region. And basically they correspond exactly with each other. So standard pressure region is northern domestic airspace, and southern domestic airspace is altimeter setting region. And so what that means is when you're in the southern domestic airspace, what they want you to do is when you're flying, you set your altimeter to whatever the altimeter setting is for wherever it is you're flying over. And the reason for that is because there are obviously a ton more airports and weather station in the southern domestic airspace that you can set your altimeter to when you're flying along, to keep it as accurate as possible. Because remember, your altimeter needs to have the correct pressure baseline to give a correct reading of your altitude. But in the standard pressure region, so northern domestic airspace, you just set your altimeter when you're flying along to the standard 29.92, right? Remember, that's the ICAO standard atmosphere pressure reading. And the reason for that is because there aren't many airports at all up there, and there's no point in trying to set it to whatever the closest airport is, because even that might be hundreds and hundreds of miles away. So pretty small rule, but important to know about in terms of air law. But yeah, so southern domestic airspace is also the altimeter setting region, and northern domestic airspace is also the standard pressure region. Okay, now let's talk about airspace classifications. So there are 7 of them that we need to know about, and they are class A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So let's go through and there's a lot of like very little differences between them, like very nuanced differences, but we're going to talk about the really big differences to help you distinguish them apart. So first off, class A airspace, the 2 main things are that it's only for IFR airplanes, so planes flying instrument flight rules. So remember, that means ones that are only referring to the instruments in the cockpit, right? Not by VFR, visual flight rules, which is what most recreational pilots fly with. And that's because it's class A is between 18,000 and 60,000 feet. So very, very high up. So that would be like the cruising altitude for airliners and stuff. So not where like, you or I would go if we're just flying a plane with cadets. Class B airspace is controlled airspace between 12,500 and 18,000 feet. So that's not IFR only, but it's still quite high. And the point is that it's controlled, so there is someone directing traffic in that airspace. Class C is usually controlled airspace around or near an airport. So, for example, London International is a Class C control zone. So what that means is it's just a zone around an airport, so from the surface up to a certain altitude, where there's a control tower directing people. And the key here, the key differentiator is that VFR traffic needs permission to enter. So the controller has to allow you to come in. Now, that's very similar to Class D airspace, which is also controlled airspace, typically around or near an airport. But the minor difference is that you only need to let the controller know that you're coming in before you do. So you technically don't need permission. You only need to tell them that you're going to do that. And so the reason for even having these two separate ones is that Class C is usually for busier airports where the controller can deny you permission if there's too many people inside. If it's a Class D airport, they can't deny anyone, which means they probably don't think it's going to get very busy. So like I said, London is a Class C airport, for example. Windsor is a Class D airport. So I guess NAV Canada just assumes Windsor is less busy than London. Class E, is basically just the least controlled airspace, essentially. You don't need permission. I believe you don't need to tell anyone that you're even going in, but I believe there is a controller you can talk to if necessary to resolve conflicts and things like that. But the way I remember it is it's the least controlled airspace. Class F is special use airspace. So that can be for air shows, it can be for parachuting. It's usually like temporary, right? Like if there's an air show, then Transport Canada or NAV Canada will designate a certain area as Class F airspace. And so within that, you can have two types. You can have Class F restricted, which means nobody's allowed in at all, right? So if it's a air show, for example, or some kind of military drill, they just want people to stay away. But it can also be Class F advisory, so you just have to be aware of it. You're allowed to fly through it, but you just have to be aware that there's something happening. So that's special use airspace. And then Class G is everything else, so uncontrolled airspace. So there's no controller, there's no one resolving any issues for you. It's all up to you. You have to be communicating if there's a radio frequency at all. But yeah, no rules in terms of permission, clearance, that sort of thing. That's completely uncontrolled airspace. Okay, let me check for any questions. How do they detect the future of the aircrafts? Oh, I assume that was for the...
Yeah, I already answered that.
Oh, okay, gotcha, okay. Which class is Pearson Airport?
Man, which one do you think it is? Just type it in there. Can you go back to the slide with the classifications?
Sure. So,
man, which classification do you think that Pearson Airport would be?
So I believe Pearson is Class C, if I'm not mistaken. I just Googled it, actually. I cheated, but
yeah, you're right. It is Class C.
Yeah. So Class A.
The reason why it's not Class A is Class A airspace is if you're flying strictly instrument rules and you're at altitude between 18,000 and 60,000 feet. Now,
Yeah.
unless they jacked Pearson Airport up in the air, I don't think it's Class A.
Yeah. So Class A is 18,000 to 60,000. Class B is just controlled, but it's 12,500 and 18,000. So it might be the controller from Pearson who's controlling that Class B airspace, but the actual airport itself would be in Class C airspace. So you need permission to enter. So Class A and B are only at altitude, so 12,500 to 18,000. and 18,000 to 60,000. Okay. So let's move on, talk about some more air laws. So
just 1 second.
sure.
Flight Sergeant Mohammed, on the VASI light system, they're on all the time, but they have kind of like a polarized lens on them. So depending on where you are in the glide path, there's different colors that you're going to get that shines through the prism on the front of that lens. So it's not autocorrect or anything like that. It's depending on where you are in the glide path, the light shines through the prism on the front of the VASI lights, and that's the different color lights that you're going to get. Do you understand that now?
Yes. Also by autocorrect, I meant the phone's autocorrect. When I was typing it,
autocorrect. Yeah, I hate that too. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so let's talk about some more air laws. So the governing rules, so like the Bible of Canadian air laws, is what's called the CARS, the Canadian Aviation Regulations. It's about 100 pages that outlines all the kind of basic level of laws for the sky. And so we're going to talk about a bit about the important parts of what's inside it. So the first one is what documents you have to carry on board when you're flying. And so the acronym we use to remember that is AeroGIL. So 7 items that have to be carried on board. So the A would be the Certificate of Airworthiness, which is basically a certificate that says, okay, this plane is in good enough condition to be flying. You have the Certificate of Registration, the R, which, as it sounds like, it's almost like a license plate, but for a plane, just to show that the government knows what it is. You have the owner's manual, weight and balance, to show that that's been calculated. You have the journey log, which is like a diary for every single thing, every journey the plane has flown, every trip it's been on. You have the proof of insurance. The plane has to be insured, much like a car. And you have to have the licenses for all the pilot and crew on board. So AeroGIL. Cool. So let's talk about right of way. So what do you do if you think you might hit someone? So when 2 aircraft are approaching head on, so you're flying along and you see another plane coming towards you directly in front of you, you are both supposed to turn to the right. Right? And if you both turn to the right, you'll start going in an opposite direction from each other. That's what you remembered to do. If you're flying along and you see another plane in front of you that's going in the same direction of you, but it's going slower and you want to overtake it, you're supposed to pass it on the right. So that pilot in front of you should look out of his right window and see you passing him. When you're flying along and let's say you see a plane on your left, right, and you think you're both converging, right, you think you might hit each other going forward because you're both generally going in the same direction, the one with the other one on its right must give way, and so that's that overtaking rule, right? If you have the other plane on your right, then you have to give way. You have to say, okay, I have to change my course a little so I don't hit him. And so the right of way, and so that is only, all these rules are only the case if you're the same type of aircraft. So a Cessna and another Cessna, or sorry, a plane, a fixed wing plane and another fixed wing plane, or a balloon and another balloon. But like, let's say it's 2 entirely different types of aircraft, right? Like, let's say you're, about to hit a balloon head on. The thing is, there's a right of way priority list. And so the reason for that is because different types of aircraft are more maneuverable than others. So the right-of-way priority goes balloons, gliders, airships, and then the rest of us, so power-driven planes or helicopters. So balloons obviously get biggest priority for right-of-way because they're the least maneuverable, right? It's a lot easier to change direction when you're in a Cessna or something than it is when you're a balloon. The second would be gliders, and the reason for that is because they don't have an engine, obviously. Gliders are always falling, you might say. So if they suddenly have to change direction, it's a lot tougher for them, like if they were trying to head to a certain place. The next one would be airships, right? So like the Goodyear blimp you have right there. Because even though it's a little hard for it to move around, it can still stay up in the air for as long as it wants, essentially, unlike a glider. And then the rest, so any power-driven plane or helicopter. And then so the last little note there, an aircraft towing something has priority over others in its class. So if a Cessna and another Cessna are about to hit each other, but one of them is carrying like a banner or something behind it, or towing a glider, for example, it gets right of way against the other type of plane in its class. So right of way is very important. So yeah, just remember those. These are ones that are typically asked on the exam as well. Yeah, pass on the right, overtake on the right, change your course to the right if you're approaching head on, and give way if you are on the right. Or no, sorry, you have right of way if you're on the right, which is why you pass on the right. Okay, let's talk about fuel and night requirements. So if you're flying VFR, visual flight rules, the law says that you need to have enough fuel to reach your destination, obviously, plus 30 minutes reserved during the day, so 30 minutes extra, 45 minutes at night, right? Obviously at night, because they assume it's a little harder to find your destination. If you're flying IFR, it's 45 minutes of extra fuel for both day and night. So legally speaking, in terms of flying, night is officially designated as the period that begins 30 minutes after sunset and ending 30 minutes before sunrise. And so those 30-minute periods are called evening and morning civil twilight, legally speaking. So night doesn't begin until 30 minutes after after sunset, and day legally begins 30 minutes before sunrise. Right, because you might get a bit of twilight for both of those. So in terms of the types of lights you need to have on your plane when flying at night, you need a green light on your right wingtip, and a red light on your left wingtip, and then a white light on your tail. And then, so you can see there, they listed the angles you need to be able to see them through, right? So, yeah, I'm sorry, I see one of them says 110, one of them says 100. Both of them should be 110. And they all need to be visible for 2 miles. On the tail, the white light has to be visible for 140 degrees. But the important thing to remember is the colors. So a green light on your right wingtip, red light on your left, white on your tail. Okay, let's talk about some other regulations that are important. So if you're flying over water, you have to carry life jackets for everyone on board, only if you're going further than landing distance and or 50 nautical miles from land. So what that means is whichever is shorter. So let's say you're flying 25 miles away from land, but you're high enough that if your engine suddenly cut out, you would be able to glide back to land. Then you don't need that life jacket. But let's say you're flying 25 miles from land, but you're very low, and if your engine cut out, you would have to land on water. Then even though you're closer than 50 nautical miles, you still need to have those life jackets. If you're flying more than 100 nautical miles in any situation, you have to be carrying a life raft that can fit all on board, right? And so that's why those big jetliners have those slides that turn into a life raft that they show you during the instructional safety video. Cool. So for aerobatics, aerobatics is defined as any maneuver that involves an intentional and abrupt change in attitude or airspeed. That's the legal definition, right? So a loop, a spin, anything like that you do on purpose. Obviously, aerobatics cannot be performed over any urban or populous area. And lastly, so an incident has to be reported to the Transportation Safety Board if it involves a serious injury or death of a person and or the aircraft sustains serious damage or was destroyed. So if any of those happen, you have to tell the government, right? And so that means basically if, if let's say you have a hard landing and your tire pops or something, that's not serious enough that you have to report it to the government. if you have a hard landing and your wheel falls off and your nose hits the ground and the propeller breaks and the engine falls out and the plane has to be scrapped, then that's probably qualifies as serious damage and you have to report it to the TSB. Okay, let's talk lastly about flight plans and flight itineraries, both of which are basically laws regarding when you have to tell people what you're doing flying. So for any flight beyond a 25-mile radius of the departure airport, you have to file either a flight plan or a flight itinerary. So for both of them, you don't have to do it unless you're going more than 25 miles. Now, a flight plan has to be under these scenarios. If you're flying across a border, if you're flying to or from a military airport, or if you're flying in the Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ, which is like a secure area near the border, for example, or near a military installation or something like that. The flight plan is more detailed and more serious than a flight itinerary. So a flight plan is this picture you see here. It's basically a document that you submit to either an air traffic control unit, a flight service station, or an FIC, a flight information center. And so as you can see there, if you look in the slide, you have to list who you are, what time you filed the thing at, what kind of plane you'll be flying, all the details about the plane, what your cruising speed is going to be, your altitude, the route you're going to fly, how long it's going to take, your expected landing time, all this really, really detailed information, how many people you have on board, what kind of equipment you have on board, right? So it's almost like an insurance policy. If you have a crash or something, and you're out in the middle of nowhere, someone is going to know that you're not where you said you were going to be, and they'll send search and rescue out for you. So with a flight plan, if you have to do what's called closing the flight plan. So once you finish your trip or your journey or whatever, you have to call whoever you filed your flight plan with and say, hi, I've landed now and I want to close my flight plan. And they'll say, okay, thank you. And they'll stop having it. And the reason for that is if you don't close your flight plan within 1 hour of your stated arrival time, then they'll immediately tell search and rescue to come find you. That's why a flight plan is very important to have if you're going to be flying over a rural area or doing something that you want someone to know in case you don't make it to your destination. So that's very serious. A flight itinerary is a lot less kind of serious than a flight plan, and it can be filed with, legally speaking, it can be filed with so an ATC unit, an FSS, or an FIC, or it can be filed with what's called legally a quote-unquote responsible person, which can be, your mom, your dad, your brother if you want, your flight instructor who stayed at the airport. It can basically be anyone that you deem to be responsible. But the flight itinerary it has to be nowhere near as detailed as a flight plan. For one thing, it doesn't have to be on a official looking sheet like this. It's basically you have to tell people your, basically what you're doing and when you're going to be back. It can be as simple as that. I remember one of my ground school instructors said, legally speaking, it can be written on a cocktail napkin and given to whoever. And the only legal requirement for your responsible person, whoever it is that you told you're going to be doing what you're going to be doing, is that they technically have, or they legally have 24 hours before they have to notify search and rescue if you haven't returned within after 24 hours of when you said you're going to return. And so that's a long time, obviously. And also because it's not with an official, you don't have to do it with someone official like an ATC unit or something like that. A flight itinerary would be, technically a less safe option than to file a flight plan and be more safe that way, where they have to initiate search and rescue only within an hour of you not coming back within your ETA. So yeah, that's flight plan, flight itinerary. I believe, yep, that's the end of our lesson for today. So if anyone has any questions, type them in the chat now. Otherwise, we'll make sure to post both quiz 3 and today's PowerPoint on the Facebook, I think that was the easiest place for you guys to access it. And
I emailed the quiz to our webmaster, and it'll be going up on Facebook fairly shortly. So quiz 3. Would you like me to send out quiz 4 as well in advance?
yeah, you know what? That's a good idea. Let's do that as well, so you guys can have that one as well. We actually only have about, I believe, 3 to 4 more PowerPoints left, which is